She walked out of her house at 4 in the afternoon with 7 boxes of candy mints and a smile on her face. She never came back. And for 63 years, the man who took her never faced a single consequence. He lived his life. He died a free man. And everyone who loved Candy Rogers went to their graves without ever knowing his name. Until now. Welcome to Cold Case Crimes, where the coldest cases eventually find their heat. If you've never been here before, subscribe now and hit that notification bell, because every story we tell is the kind that keeps you up at night long after the screen goes dark. This is the story of Candy Rogers, and I promise you, by the time this is over, you will not forget her name. It's March of 1959, and Spokane, Washington is the kind of city where people still trust their neighbors. When the Spokane River winds through the heart of downtown, tall pines line the edges of every neighborhood, and children play outside without a second thought. It is, by every measure, a safe and quiet place to raise a family. Candy Rogers is 9 years old. She is bright and friendly and full of energy, the kind of child who lights up every room she walks into. Her mother, Elaine, is a school teacher raising Candy on her own after her marriage to Candy's father, Carl, fell apart. And despite the circumstances, Candy is flourishing. She is a 4th grader at Holmes Elementary School and an active member of the Bluebirds, the junior branch of the Campfire Girls, a youth organization dedicated to building confidence, community spirit, and a love of the outdoors in young girls. Candy goes on camping trips. She does community service. She hikes through the woods with her friends, and she loves every second of it. By all accounts, Candy Rogers is a happy, healthy little girl with her whole life ahead of her. And then comes Friday, the 6th of March, 1959. Candy comes home from school that afternoon, buzzing with purpose. The Bluebirds are fundraising for an upcoming activity, and members have been asked to sell campfire mints in their neighborhoods. Candy has 7 boxes ready and waiting. She asks her mother for permission to go out and sell them, and Elaine gives her the green light, but not without the reminder she gives every single time. Be home before dark. It is a rule Candy has never once broken. She eats an oatmeal cookie. She plays briefly with the family dog. She picks up her 7 boxes of mints and walks out the front door at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon into the cool March air. And that is the last time her mother ever sees her alive. At 5:30, Elaine begins to feel uneasy. At 6 o'clock, the unease has become fear. She knows her daughter. She knows this is not like her. She reaches out to Candy's grandfather, Stanley Newton. And within the hour, a small group of relatives, friends, and neighbors has formed and is moving through the streets asking questions. People had seen her. Multiple residents confirmed spotting Candy walking through the neighborhood earlier that afternoon, boxes of mints in hand, cheerful and purposeful. But no one knew where she had gone after that. And as the sky darkened over Spokane, the trail simply went cold. At around 7 that evening, while Candy's grandfather and a group of men were still searching the neighborhood, a car came speeding out of nowhere and nearly killed them. They barely made it out of the way in time. Shaken but refusing to stop, they pressed on into the night. By now, the police had been notified. Officers and sheriff's deputies joined the search. Flashlights swept through the darkness across streets and parks and the edges of the surrounding woodland. Then, somewhere along Paday Drive, searchers made a discovery. 6 boxes of campfire mints were found scattered on the ground. Candy had left home with 7. That night, no matter how hard they looked, there was no sign of her. Elaine barely slept. She sat in the dark of her home and prayed with everything she had that her daughter was simply lost somewhere, cold and frightened, but alive. And that morning would bring her back. Morning came. Candy did not. Within hours, hundreds of Spokane residents had poured into the streets and the surrounding woods to join the search. It was one of the largest search efforts the city had ever seen. Officers swept the area on horseback and in vehicles. The United States Air Force provided a helicopter, crewed by 4 trained personnel and a pilot, to conduct an aerial search over the Spokane River Valley. What happened next would make the tragedy of Candy Rogers even more unbearable. While flying over the Spokane River, the pilot failed to see a high-tension wire until the very last moment. The helicopter struck the wire and spiraled violently out of control before crashing into the river below. 3 of the 5 men on board were killed instantly. Airman Merleese D. Ray, Sergeant William A. McDonnell, and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fatek. 3 men who had given their lives in the effort to find one missing little girl. Spokane grieved, and then it kept searching. Day after day, the effort continued. Day after day, nothing. With every hour that passed, the hope that Candy was still alive grew smaller and smaller. And back at home, her mother Elaine was disappearing into herself. Barely eating, barely speaking, just staring into a silence she did not know how to fill. 16 days after Candy walked out her front door, 2 airmen named Howard Lawrence and Richard Bergen were hunting woodchucks in a dense wooded area, approximately 7 miles from Candy's home, when they came across something that stopped them cold. Sitting in a small clearing in the middle of the forest was a tiny pair of blue suede shoes. When they waited to see if anyone would come to claim them, no one did. The shoes were turned over to the police. Candy's grandfather was called in to identify them. He looked at them for a long moment, and then he confirmed what everyone already feared. They looked just like the shoes his granddaughter had been wearing the day she disappeared. The following morning at dawn, a search team moved into the woods. They spread out through the trees, pushing through undergrowth, scanning every inch of the forest floor. And then one officer noticed something that didn't look right. A small mound of brush and pine needles, arranged just a little too deliberately to be natural. He moved closer. He knelt down. He began brushing the debris aside. Beneath it was the body of a child. Her clothing was torn. Her feet were bound with a strip of cloth. Wrapped around her neck was another strip of fabric. Candy Rogers had been found. She was 9 years old. The autopsy confirmed the worst. Candy had been sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. Her small body hidden deep in the woods and covered with debris as if she were something to be discarded. Spokane Police Chief Clifford Payne stood before the cameras and made a promise to the city. "We will put every available man on this case," he said, "and keep them there until it is solved. We know what we're looking for now. We're looking for a maniac. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment right now and say, 'I'm still here.' I want to see who is truly following this story, because what comes next will absolutely blow your mind." Detectives worked around the clock. Tips flooded in. Dozens of people were questioned. And early on, one suspect rose above the rest. A man already sitting in prison, a serial killer named Hugh Byron Morse. The connection seemed solid. During the autopsy, investigators had noticed a strange purple smear on Candy's clothing that smelled distinctly of grape gum. Morse was notorious for his love of grape gum. It felt like the kind of detail that couldn't be coincidence. But when confronted, Morse denied any involvement. And without hard physical evidence to tie him to the crime, investigators had nowhere to go. He remained a person of interest for years, but he could never be charged. One by one, every lead they followed collapsed. Every tip turned to nothing. The case hardened into stone. 4 years after Candy's murder, in June of 1963, her father, Carl Rogers, took his own life in a hotel room in Walla Walla. He died without ever knowing who had killed his daughter. 47 years later, in September of 2006, Candy's mother, Elaine, passed away at home at the age of 82. She too died without ever knowing the truth. And still the case sat there, unsolved, unresolved, haunting every detective who ever touched it. Detective Zach Storman of the Spokane Police Department Major Crimes Unit put it simply. This is the kind of case, he said, that has been the giant log jam for cold cases in Spokane. I keep saying it's the Mount Everest of our cold cases, the one we could never seem to overcome. But at the same time, nobody ever forgot. Nobody ever forgot. By 2001, DNA technology had advanced to a point that was unimaginable in 1959. Candy's clothing, preserved as evidence for over 4 decades, was sent to a forensic laboratory. Scientists were able to isolate DNA from her underwear and construct a complete genetic profile of her killer. For the first time in more than 40 years, detectives had something real, something biological, something that could one day point them to a name. The profile was uploaded to national databases. No match was found. In 2002, it was compared against Hugh Byron Morse, who had lingered on the suspect list for nearly half a century. He was not a match. Around 2017, a new scientific method began reshaping the world of cold case investigations. It was called forensic genetic genealogy, a discipline that combines DNA analysis with traditional family history research to identify unknown individuals by mapping out their family trees through shared genetic material. It had already helped crack several high-profile cold cases across the country, and now detectives decided to apply it to Candy Rogers. Forensic scientist Brittany Wright of the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory was assigned to the case. She retrieved the DNA sample that had been sitting in a crime lab freezer since 2001, reanalyzed it to confirm it still matched the original perpetrator's profile, and then sent it to a private forensic laboratory for genealogy processing. The response that came back was a gut punch. The sample was too degraded to work with. And went after everything, after all those decades, all the preserved evidence, all that hope. The science had hit a wall. But Brittany Wright did not give up. A year later, she learned about a laboratory in Texas that had developed a specialized capability for extracting usable genetic data from highly degraded samples, the kind that other labs had already written off as unusable. The laboratory was called Othram. She reached out. They reviewed the case, and they said yes. A small portion of the remaining sample was carefully packaged and sent to Texas. 6 months later, Othram delivered their results. 3 brothers had been identified as close familial matches to the suspect's DNA profile. Their names were John, Andrew, and Terry Hoff. Further investigation revealed that all 3 men were already dead, but John Hoff had a daughter who was still alive, a woman named Kathy. Detectives made contact. By the time they called, Kathy had already been doing her own research. By that point, she said, I had already looked up the little girl murdered in 1959, so I knew who it was. She agreed to provide a DNA sample. The result was staggering. It was 2.9 million times more likely that Kathy's DNA was related to the suspect's genetic profile than that of the general population. 2.9 million times. John Hoff was their man. Detectives immediately began building a full picture of who John Hoff was. He had grown up right there in Spokane. At the time of Candy's murder in 1959, he had been living approximately 1 mile from her home. And he had enlisted in the United States Army in 1956 at the age of 17. And then in 1961, just 2 years after Candy's death, he had been arrested for assaulting a woman. He had approached her, forcibly removed her clothing as she screamed for help, used those same clothes to bind her, and then attempted to strangle her. The parallels to Candy's murder were not subtle. They were exact. The woman survived. John Hoff served 6 months in prison, was labeled a deserter by the Army, and was discharged from service. He went on to live what appeared from the outside to be an unremarkable life, working as a door-to-door salesman, then in a lumberyard. But at just 31 years of age, John Hoff took his own life. He died with his secret. He died with people believing he was an ordinary man. Detectives also uncovered one more detail that sent a chill through everyone working the case. John Hoff's stepsister had been a 10-year-old campfire girl at the time of Candy's murder and had taken on the role of Candy's big sister within the program. That was almost certainly how John Hoff had known Candy Rogers. He hadn't chosen her at random. He had known exactly who she was. There was one final step. With Kathy's permission and a court-issued search warrant, detectives traveled to the cemetery where John Hoff was buried. They exhumed his remains. A DNA sample was taken from his body and sent to the laboratory. The result was a confirmation. John Hoff was the man who had murdered Candy Rogers on the 6th of March, 1959. Former Spokane police detective Brian Hammond, he who had dedicated years of his career to this case before retiring in 2021, said it plainly. "We got extremely lucky," he said, "in that we got DNA from 1959. They had no concept of that at the time, and that's obviously what cracks the case. Otherwise, I don't believe it would have ever been solved." For Candy's surviving family members, the news landed with a weight that was impossible to describe. It wasn't justice, not in the way anyone would have hoped for. The man who killed her had died decades ago. He would never sit in a courtroom. He would never be held accountable in any formal sense. But he was named. Candy's cousin, Joanne Poss, 77 years old at the time of the announcement, said it quietly and honestly. "It's not closure," she said, "to me, but at least there's some form of satisfaction knowing that the person that did it is at least named. He may be in a grave, but he's named." The deeper grief, she said, belonged to the ones who never got to hear those words. They never saw him pay or die for it or whatever, she said of Candy's parents and grandparents. They went to their graves not knowing. And that was hard. For Kathy, the daughter of the man who did this, the revelation cracked something open that could never be closed again. She had been 9 years old when her father died. She had spent her whole life believing he had died by his own hand because of depression. Now she understood that what he had carried with him was something far darker. "I think no," she said quietly. "He was evil. It wasn't an escape away from it. I mean, he got to die with people thinking he was an upstanding man. And he wasn't." And then Kathy did something remarkable. She offered a public apology to Candy's family. Not because it was expected of her, and not because she bore any responsibility for what her father did, but because she felt it mattered. "I'm very, very sorry for what my dad did," she said, "that he took her life horribly. I hope that it gives peace, knowing that even though it's not really justice, because he doesn't get any punishment, his name has this on it now, and they can know it's solved." Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She stepped outside on a Friday afternoon in March of 1959 with 7 boxes of candy mints and the whole rest of her life in front of her. She never made it home. But 63 years later, because of the relentless determination of multiple generations of detectives, and because of a science that didn't even exist when she died, the world finally knows his name, and hers will never be forgotten. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe John Hoff planned what he did to Candy that day? Or was it a crime of opportunity? And what do you think about Kathy's public apology? Did it mean something? Or does it simply not matter when someone is already gone? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. This community always has the most powerful things to say. And if you think this story was unbelievable, Just wait until you hear what we're covering next. A case so baffling that even the detectives who solved it said they still lose sleep over it. Subscribe to Cold Case Crimes right now, and make sure that notification bell is on, because these are the stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Rest in peace, Candy Rogers.